that people want,
yeah,
want to access material.
Yeah. But no, yeah, thank you for, this is gonna be on the recording, but yeah, John, thank you for coming to the business meeting. That was very helpful to have you there. So it's top of the hour. Should we wait another couple minutes for people to come in? Okay. Okay, why don't we get started? I'm sure as folks come in, I'll just add them to the room. So welcome everybody to the one of a few professional development sessions. This one is publishing a scholarly book, a roundtable. And while most sessions here at the conference will have the chair of the session introduce all the participants, this one will work a little differently in terms of audience participation and in terms of the structure of it as a roundtable as opposed to a series of standalone presentations. So instead of me introducing everybody, I'm going to turn it over to our four participants. So I don't know, y'all decided how you were going to run it. So whoever wants to kick us off, go right ahead.
So I'll start. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. The way that we're intending on running this session is for each of us to introduce ourselves and the presses that we represent. And that will give you a sense a little bit of kind of the diversity of range within university presses and the kinds of things they do and where they are. And then we are going to open it up for questions. We feel pretty strongly that, if you have questions, we want to address them up front. And then we're prepared to talk about the life cycle of a book from the point where it's conceived to the point where it is disseminated, distributed, marketed. And then finally, we have some myth busting that we can talk about, some general misconceptions or what we are often, things we often hear about university press publishing that we are eager to dispel. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to get to those. So we're going to be very like Bloomsburian ad hoc-y workshop-y about this and privilege your questions over anything that we've prepared because, well, I mean, we hope that what we've prepared is informative and enriching and interesting. But if you have specific questions, we want to make sure that we get to those instead of leaving 2 minutes at the end. So anyway, my name is John Morgenstern. I direct Clemson University Press. Many of you are familiar with our publishing program because we really started publishing academic work through publishing the selected papers from this conference. Our publishing program has since grown from 3 to 4 books a year, oftentimes poetry collections and things like that thrown in to get to that 4 PDFs online. To being a member of the Association of University Presses, publishing between 40 and 50 journal issues and books per year. This year is going to be a little bit of a low year. We had this like real big boom during the pandemic, but then actually now we're dealing with the lull that occurred from giving all the flexibility that was necessary and required. So we won't hit that marker this year, but that's okay. Anyway, so our core of our publishing program is in 18th century to contemporary literature and the arts, regional books, history, southern books, guides, field guides. So if you know anyone who's really interested in publishing, say like a trail guide to Southeast, I'm your guy to talk to. We also publish a suite of journals that really have a broad scope. So, we're more capacious in thinking about journals acquisition. So some of them, like International Yates Studies, the Rod Frost Review, are, really aligned closely with that core of our monograph and edit collection program. But we also publish a water resources journal, the Journal of Extension, the national flagship for extension educators. And, we are also taking on the Journal of Youth Development, which is the 4-H's journal for the National Journal for 4-H. So a bit capacious there. And you will find in the book flyers circulated that you can get a discount during Dalloway Day sale next week, including Ben's book. So by all means, please take a look at it. If I remember correctly, it's 50% off the book, including some of the paperbacks that are available now. So you can get a pretty good price on them. Regrettably, for reasons we could talk about, academic books tend to be pretty expensive. So taking advantage of these sales. So give it a look, no pressure. Anyway, thanks so much.
I'm happy to
Stephanye.
go.
Okay,
Sure.
yeah, Anna-Marie. Yeah.
Sure, I'm happy to go next. So hello, everyone. My name is Anna-Maria Jimenez-Moreno. I go by Anna or Anna. There's no wrong way to say it. I'm the acquisitions editor for the Ohio State University Press. I specifically publish in literary and cultural studies. We have an academic imprint as well as a nonfiction trade imprint, as well as a regional trade imprint. And in terms of what OSU has published in the past, certainly a kind of steady trickle of modernist studies works, and especially with the Harlem Renaissance, kind of focus on that because of our history in publishing in African-American literary studies. But we also have a classic series, classical memories, modern identities, that sometimes fuses the kind of modernist authors with kind of their approach to classical studies. And yes, our books also on the flyer do take advantage of the discount, and I'll hand it off to Stephanie.
I'm Stephanie Hunter. I'm the editor-in-chief at the University Press of Florida. I'm the acquiring editor for a couple of different subjects for our books in Latin American and Caribbean studies, dance, and modernist and medieval literature. And so, of course, the modernist literature is what I'm representing today. You may be familiar with our Florida James Joy series. That's a big part of our modernist literature list. We also do books on, I'm very interested in doing more on women modernist writers, including Virginia Woolf. So a lot of our recent books in modernist literature have either featured some of Woolf in dialogue with other modernist writers, and we're interested in continuing to build that.
Hi, James Gifford, Director of Fairleigh Dickinson University Press, and we do have a new modernist studies in the avant-garde series, which is directed by Stephen Ross, the University of Victoria Stephen Ross, not the one in Ontario. Now that we've got two of them publishing in the same discipline, often on the same topic, which runs, I run into that too. We have very small number of journals, primarily in medieval, early modern, and history. In comparison to John, I don't think we've ever crossed the upper 40s for the number of books per year. We tend to average somewhere closer to 20 to 25 per year. And I'm looking forward to any questions all of you have.
Great, so we're happy to open the floor to questions. Any questions whatsoever that motivated you to come to the session. And you can put it in chat. We're happy to read it there, or you can unmute yourself. And we're very personable people. We like to talk. So.
Joshua, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, hi everyone. I was wondering sort of at what stage you might, as an editor, wants to be approached by someone with a book. Is it okay to approach? Do you need to sort of have a fully fleshed out proposal or even a manuscript before approaching someone, or is it okay to just sort of go, "Hi, I have an idea. What do you think?"
Who wants to go first on that? I'll speak for my own perspective. Anytime. It varies depending on the nature of the project. We probably don't say it too often. It depends on what career stage someone's at, if they're seeking, say, an advanced contract and what have you. But at any stage, if someone shows up with a complete manuscript, well, yippee, we can take a quick look and maybe it gets out to peer review very fast. But at the same time, if you're working on a new project, a new idea, and you're trying to suss out what would be the place that would have the best fit for you and your work, by all means, you can approach editors at that stage as well, and everywhere in between. If anyone.
So I'll just add to that you should think of, I'm sort of big on the idea of like alt at careers not always being alt, right? In the sense that all of us who are editors for scholarly works at university presses are actually pretty integral to the interinstitutional infrastructure to support the disciplines in which you're working. And we actually, I went from being a scholar who works on articles in a very narrow way and reading things that only pertain to my work to trying to see the field whole. And each of us have a sense of what's going to be trendy in a year because we're looking at those proposals now, right? So I think that if you should think of us as resources, as experts who are there to help you along the way in getting out what you want to say. Or the work that you want to put out there. So you might have questions that are about a project that you have, that you've been thinking about or dreaming about or working on and wanting to know whether or not that's something that there's a place for. And it's just a dream. And it could be a conversation, it could be a random email, or you could have a proposal. Some people working through the proposal really helps them think through what the project is. And I'm honestly better at responding to a proposal than I am to an unformulated idea, which doesn't mean I can't have that conversation. It's just, I don't want the book to be the book I want you to write. I want you to write the book you want to write. So I remember having a conversation with Ben about his book. And I remember I was walking around my office barefoot because I just got this new carpet. I remember our conversation, it was like a very fun conversation for about an hour thinking through. And I got to ask a lot of questions as he was, thinking about his proposal. And I hope that the conversation, being a springboard for him, helped him in conceptualizing the project and what it can do and what the audience could be and the kinds of things that we think about as editors. But at the same time, it was really enriching for me. So it's not an inconvenience to talk to authors. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, I encourage it at any stage. I think that choosing a press, you need to think about who the editor is that you're going to be working with and make sure that they're a good fit. You're going to be spending a lot of time working with this person. And so it's important that they understand your goals for the project, that they are enthusiastic about the project and that you trust them and like working with them. And so having those early conversations with different editors, when you have that ability, you haven't committed quite yet, kind of gives you a sense of who you'd like to work with on that project.
And I'll just add that you shouldn't at the same time assume that your editor is going to have subject expertise in the area. Of course, that's always ideal and wonderful. They still might be very enthusiastic and kind of see how it works in a broader scholarly community. And we're going to be, once we really commit to a work, we want it to be out, we want to help you fulfill this goal. But again, that might be a thing, something to consider. And also lastly, I will echo what everybody has said, but it would also help us in what capacity you want us to provide feedback. Do you want it to be as sort of, if there is that content expertise, do you want it to kind of in that sense? Do you want it as an editor? Do you want it as, is this physically possible? And you're thinking maybe like a digital humanities project, or like, has this ever been done? Or is this about kind of the content? So helping us to assess the work is really kind of knowing in what capacity we're supposed to respond to you. But yes, absolutely, whether it's an idea of a thought, half-baked thought, or it's kind of halfway there, or it's a full manuscript or a proposal. It's wonderful to talk about these ideas.
It's a good question too.
maybe as we're waiting for another question, just to tack on, yeah, since John referred to it, like I remember, I think this was the Pasadena MSA. I had met John before at the T.S. Eliot annual meeting, I think, but I saw him in the book exhibit room at the Clemson table. And because I had met him before, I felt comfortable to go up and just start chatting. But that quickly became not so much a let's catch up, as opposed to I was really happy that he wanted to talk about the work and was curious about it. And I was surprised, just given what I had feared about university press directors and editors, you know, I don't even remember what I thought at the time, but I was really happy with how closely we worked, even as early as the proposal writing stage, on thinking through that project, and the encouragement he gave me to kind of make it my own project. So this is just to say, if you have an idea, yes, you know, think about approaching someone. Kim, go ahead.
Hi, I have a question about, I did not need a book for tenure. I broke my dissertation up into articles and have published articles since then. After tenure, I got grabbed by the administrative monsters and am on my way out of that, happily, very happily, after this next year. And I've got 2 projects right now, but I mean, I don't know which one's gonna, well, I do know which one I'm working on first now, so it'll be the first one out. But the demons in my head say, you've never published a book before. How do you do this when you're further along in your career and you haven't yet done a book? So I guess my question is anxiety about first time, and not first time, you know, right out of the gate, this is your dissertation becoming a book, first time since then, if that's a reasonable anxiety to have, or if I should lock that demon up and throw away the key.
Well, I don't know how anybody else feels, but I feel like a good editor is obviously not going to be your therapist, but is going to be you know, unfortunately, we'd be
No, I don't need that. I don't need that.
No, I know. I'm sort of making a joke, but we are friends with the people that we end up working with, right? And so I think having an editor with whom you mesh well, and who can encourage you and give you some guidelines and structure in order to kind of move forward, I think is probably, you know, a real asset, like, you know, to sort of dovetail on what Stephanie was saying. But the other thing is, remember when you're writing a dissertation and you thought that the bar was really high, and, you know, you thought when you went into your defense that you were never going to pass, or that they were going to ask you some arcane question that you'd imagined. And then actually the whole conversation was this loving, supportive conversation about your work in a way that no one had ever paid that much attention to or given you that much encouragement, right? And then, you know, you're like, oh, I'm not sure if, you know, these articles, you know, the second reader, darn second reader, this is going to be a miserable process and totally overwording, and I'm never going to get published. And then, you know, you published a bunch of articles, and actually now you're reviewing for those journals. And, you know, I think every new step feels very intimidating, but the difference between a series of articles and a book, right, is that one is a longer sustained argument where you're more fully exploring a broader theme, concept, idea, you know, and putting yourself within a broader conversation of scholars, many of whom you know, right? Many of whom will read drafts of the thing for you. Many of whom, you know, are going to help you see the holes in your argument or help you anticipate what reviewers might say. And then there are peer reviewers. And if they're doing it right, peer reviewers are not gatekeepers, but they are, you know, they're peers who are meant to be giving you supportive, productive feedback, ideas, engaging with your work, you know, on a fairly high level. And, you know, your editor is going to do the same thing. And then a faculty board will do the same thing. And, you know, throughout the process, you'll have lots of people working with you on it. So I think the worst misconception is that a book is something that you're going to do on your own. And that, you know, it's intimidating because you've never done that before. You'll be working with lots of people, including peers in the field and editors and, you know, this group and maybe other people who haven't written books who are want to work with you and share swap chapters and introductions and things like that. It's really a community driven effort, right? So it's scary if you're doing it alone, but you're not alone. So hopefully that makes it a little less intimidating. Maybe somebody else has more practical advice. I went touchy-feely.
Just get it done. I'm being facetious, but it really is about getting the portion of the research done, but also just sitting down and writing, which I try to making those ideas, those flashy things that are exciting to you, put it down on paper or in in a Word document or whatever you might use. But really, I think sometimes that is a stumbling block. That sometimes we have conversations with authors, and there's again a grain of a thought there, and it doesn't evolve into something, and that's just really sad, because again, sometimes we have really exciting conversations. So I think it is really about just sitting down and getting that time dedicated to finishing whatever you think it's going to be necessary. And also sometimes, and I was in a panel recently about second books, and which I know is not your particular case, but the fact that there are different kinds of pressures. Once you think, oh, I've worked so hard to get tenure, I've worked so hard for this professional or personal achievement, and then all pressures are off, and it's like, well, that's not really true, because I have all these other kinds of committee commitments. I have, my children are at the stage of their life, or my partner is at this stage, and again, to really think about the subjective nature of these relationships, which I think we've all been driving at, is that it is a subjective relationship. Like, does this acquisitions editor, do they really respond in a way that is respectful and mindful of myself, and not as only as a scholar, but when I'm going to deliver the thing, are there things that are negotiable? What are the things that are negotiable in this relationship? But it shouldn't be a scary thing at all, or an anxiety driven thing, because I feel like most of the time maybe the narrative of it is kind of an unequal power dynamic. But really do remember that you have what we want and what we need and what we seek to publish, and so you really do have, thinking about it, like stepping into that position, stepping into that relationship, like with the upper hand in a sense.
I think part of this may or may not be the thing that you're anxious about, but approaching presses and submitting your book idea and being afraid of getting rejected. From my perspective, when I do have to reject a lot of proposals, but most of the time it's because of fit. It's because it doesn't fit very well with the direction our list is going, not because it's a bad book. And if I know what my colleagues at other university presses are publishing. And so if it's not a good fit for me, I can maybe tell you, I think this would be a better fit for Anna's press, right? And so looking at it as again, this community where, it's not a rejection of your work, it's just trying to find the best home, the most appropriate home for your book.
I'd lean into Stephanie's point. If you're not sure if a press is a good fit, you can approach an acquisitions editor. And if it isn't a good fit, or if there's someone who they think would really be ideal for you to work with, in general, we're going to tell you that. It's not necessarily rejection because your project isn't interesting or exciting, but we know someone who would be the ideal person to work with. Because when we do these conferences face-to-face, most often those of us with the presses go out and have, a good chin wag when you're off doing the same thing with your other academic colleagues. And it's also not uncommon at all for a first book to be post-tenure. I know that a lot of people will have the feeling, I need to get a book so that I can get tenure. I don't know if I'd say it's as common, but it is still very common for someone to say, I feel like this is something I've wanted to accomplish before I retire, or I felt like this is what I need to do before I go up for full. And lots of schools, including R1s, do not necessarily require a book for tenure, so it is not unusual. That said, you bring a lot to an editor who knows, you might not have the tenure clock ticking, because note, if you have a tenure clock ticking. Tell the press. I had an author who was denied tenure a number of years ago and never told me that there was a tenure clock. And I could have provided a letter, and I still feel awful that I was never told. Let us know. But at the same time, post tenure, we know you have more flexibility, you have more contacts, you have more familiarity with the process, even if it's been primarily for articles. And I don't want to say thick-skinned when it comes to reviewers, because in general, reviewers are pretty generous and helpful, despite the reader number 2 that John points to. But you would have much familiarity with that. So I wouldn't worry about it in the slightest for approaching editors. Just, make sure it's something you tell us so that we know, because it helps us to understand your context.
Thanks, that's helpful. I think it's more the knowing that you're not the only one who's doing the first book after tenure that's helpful. It's like the rejection and all that I've been doing for long enough that that's not the big deal, but it's the kind of, really, is anybody else doing this, or am I the only one that's doing this for, post tenure? So thank you very much. That's helpful.
I should add, there's also lots of reasons. We had a recent book by someone who was at a college, a college that became a university that did not require tenure, but was full-time permanent faculty. And then they switched over to become a university and needed to have stratified faculty ranks as a consequence of that transformation. And he was going to get tenure, but he needed to do a book. It's not quite this, they're already a permanent full-time. There's lots and lots of reasons. So yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for doing this. This is really helpful for me. I was going to ask about the process. Once you agree on the subject and you accept the proposal, do you receive the book chapter by chapter, or do you get it, as a finished whole book? And I was also wondering about the reviewing process. Is there any chance for the book to be rejected after you finish it? I mean, after your all, communications with the author and all the process of writing, is there any chance for it to be rejected again? Thank you.
So I think we'll all have slightly different answers for this, just ever so slightly, because while every university press is going to privilege the peer review process, that's one of the ways in which we're distinct from other publishers. We all, peer review does not mean the same thing to everybody, right? Like there's set standards, but everyone's approach is a little bit different. So at Clemson, we offer pre-publication contracts on the basis of a peer-reviewed proposal and sample chapter. And I always encourage folks to include the introduction, because peer reviewers of a certain age, that's something that has changed in the last, 10 years or so, maybe 15. And, most of the people that you think right out of the gate would be a good reader for that is someone who's, published a book and is established in the field, right? And so you ask them, and what they had to do was submit the complete manuscript, and they couldn't, get a contract until the complete manuscript was there. So the way in which they meet the task that you set them is with a bias, right? So if you give them chapter 3, and chapter 3 is excellent, and the proposal maps out how it fits into the overall book, and there's no red flag there, they'll still say, well, but it's hard to see how this constellates with a broader argument, for a sustained monograph. So I'd be wary to give this the contract until I could read the entire manuscript, right? If you give them the introduction, on the other hand, they talk about the big argument. And they talk about how the big argument constellates outward. They talk about how, you might think of, I see in chapter 4, you deal with this text, are you aware that there are 3 variants of that text and they're at this particular archive? If you give them the overview in the introduction of what the main argument is and how you're going to go about, making that argument, then their feedback is much more useful, right? But they're also sort of primed to think about the big picture in a way that they're not with some other, chapter. And we offer pre-publication contracts, which do include in there the right to, if if the manuscript is peer reviewed and does not meet the standards of the press, that there is a sort of an opportunity for the press to say, I'm sorry, this falls really short of what you'd proposed, and this didn't get through peer review, and I think it's best if we just part ways. In actual practice, though, I mean, that's legalese. It's like when you get a credit card and there's all this fine print, and actually you use the credit card to pay the bill. You use the credit card to pay the bill. You get your cash rewards. Like that. The vast majority of the things in that you never really need to know. And it's kind of the same thing in that when an editor is supporting your project and brings it to an editorial board in order to get approval and give it a pre-publication contract, you have a champion for your work, right? That person has signed up to champion your work, and they don't want to remove it from the list, right? They want to publish it. They want to work on it. They're excited about it. And so when books come in, I look at the manuscript. Peer reviewers, sometimes have recommendations, but at that point in the process, for me, I've already made a commitment, and the commitment is if you met your commitment, then we're going to work together until the manuscript is where it needs to be to publish. So if I have had the circumstance a couple of times where someone has projected an 80,000 word manuscript about a topic, and it was very scholarly and did everything that it needed to do for an academic monograph. And then between the 3 years between they had a pre-publication contract and the time that they submitted the manuscript, they had a revelation that they wanted to be a public historian, instead, public literary scholar, public intellectual. And what they delivered was something with, no citations, didn't engage in scholarship, was the kind of thing where, it starts out, I'm making it up, but it starts out with like, it was a cold, windy morning, in October, 1847, and I'm like, well, that's not an academic monograph. That's not what we talked about publishing. It sounds like the kind of book you want to publish is not the kind of book we publish. And so we had to have a conversation. Is this the kind of thing you want to do? Because if it's the kind of thing you want to do, I'm not going to hold you back. But if it is the thing, if it isn't the thing you want to do, let me help explain to you why, like, do you have a weather report from that day? Did you look at newspapers? What citation for the weather, right? Like, you're opening yourself up to scrutiny from a reviewer who's not going to review it in private for a peer review report that only a couple of people are going to see, but they're going to review it in the TLS, like this is going to be a very public thing. And you really don't want that kind of, attention. Like, this is sloppy scholarship, or whatever the case may be. You're not going to have that same scrutiny if it's a public intellectual's book, right? People will just accept that somehow that person knows that it was windy, right? And so eventually the person decided, I think I want to take my book somewhere else, because I really want it to be the kind of book that's priced at $25 and available at Waterstones. And I said, of all of the things in the universe going on, I do not want to be the thing, I have a contract with you and you're going to do it, darn it. I just, life's too short, I'll set you free. You go do what you want to do, and I hope you find the right person to do it. The book became something other than what we agreed to publish. Other than that, it's so anyway, that's just a way of saying, yes, it's possible, but it's highly unlikely. That's at Clemson. You others may have a different.
I don't mind jumping in, but if Anna or Stephanie want to go first, that's fine with me. Okay. I can address this two ways. As a faculty member, my previous book was rejected after 2 rounds of reviews with the press, and I took it elsewhere, and it was immediately, spontaneously, and enormously welcomed by the blind readers, and then won the Mythical Poetic Award for scholarship. So it certainly happens. That said, as John points out, I don't want to perpetuate myths that we'll be busting later on if people run into questions. But 2 things that presses don't have enough of are usually money and time, but in the opposite order. We don't have enough time to do everything that we want to do. So if an editor has worked with you on getting your book ready and prepared and having it out to readers and supporting you through revisions and getting it back out to readers again, we're on your side, because there's a monetary investment in peer review, but there's a time investment. And if we put that time in with you, we want your book to be successful, and we will work with you to find ways for it to succeed. That's the goal, and that matters more than the money. That said, we see a lot of reader reports. We tend to know how most readers will respond. We tend to know our editorial boards pretty well, and how they react to different things. So if you've made a proposal and we've talked with you in detail about the project and we've reviewed a manuscript, we're pretty sure that this is the kind of thing we want to see going forward. There's that element to it as well. So I wouldn't say worry yourself too much about getting an entire book written and sending it out for peer review and it being turned down, because it's an awful lot like dissertation defenses. You shouldn't be walking into the room unsure of how things are going to go. If it's been through peer review and you're going to the second round, you should have a pretty solid understanding of what the most likely outcomes are. And we ought to be communicating that to you and talking with you about it. So if you've got concerns about those things at any stage in the process, talk to your editor, and we will give sound advice, because it's something, we see this all the time.
I'd say yes to what John and James has said in terms of just the logistics for example, for OSU Press. We also can, so for our process, we allow people to either submit a proposal or a manuscript, and for that to start the peer review process. Sometimes with some presses, the proposal is not, and you as a first-time author, you can't submit a proposal, although I'm sure that's really changing. But for OSU, again, what I prefer is a very like a prospectus, so a very thorough overview of what the book is about. And it's a weird document, I will admit it. The proposal is a very strange document because it's facing two ways. It's facing your editor, who again may or may not have subject expertise and wants certain kinds of information about it, and it's really in the guidelines, and I think all of us presses have that about word length, amount of images, kind of very specific things about competing books, which you shouldn't get worried about. It's just like, who are the people, who are the books that you are in conversation with, but things that your typical your peers are not going to really be interested. Is this a 70,000 word book, or is it a 110,000 word book? It's not. They're not going to be attuned to those types of questions. So it is a really weird genre. So as many examples that you can get about what a proposal is and how it's formed, that's great. Even if it's not within your own field, although that would be ideal. But sometimes you can't choose your mentors, or you can't choose who's willing to be a good Samaritan and share that information with you. Please try to see some samples to see what are the kinds of things that they're asking me. So an updated CV, and I typically ask for 2 sample chapters just so that readers get a good sense of the breadth as well as the depth of your argument, because they'll most likely you will have an article out, and you can do that very, very well and efficiently, but kind of doing that a movement of arguing across, across a broader range, that is something that we really want to highlight that you can do. I would just say that it's your most polished work, is what I would say, but not polished in the sense like, oh, this was published in, whatever journal it is. So it says this article is going to argue. No, make sure that it's translated into monograph chapter form, that you fully have gone through and seen how is this in conversation with what came before and what came after. And I think we're nonetheless, with John, I do agree that I do want to see that somewhere in that proposal, those proposal materials, whether you do give me an introduction, a body chapter or 2 body chapters, or a really thorough prospectus part of it, that you're really doing the heavy lifting on what is this about and getting to it really rather quickly. What are you arguing? Methodology, because and kind of all the important facets of the project to be there. What is the organization in terms of chapter abstracts? So that because peer review is not unfortunately a conversation between it can become a conversation, a speaking point between you and your editor. It can ideally hopefully give you feedback. Like, I think if you maybe address these final things, it'll be in really good shape for peer review. But with your readers, it's not really a back and forth, even though we do typically ask for a letter of response to the reports. So again, in terms of logistics at OSU, we can either start again a proposal or a manuscript. It goes out to 2 external readers that we commission. If both those reports are positive, we can enter into a pre-completion, sometimes called an advance contract, where there'll be language in the contract that if you complete the manuscript or if you do revisions or if it's yay okay, we'll just take it to the board, and that will be the kind of the final term on our end to fulfill that obligation to publish your book. And then one quick thing I'll say, please do save your agreements and contracts and permissions. It was going to save you so much anxiety later on. So whatever it is that you're signing, whether you, like me, kill trees, unfortunately, print it out and put it in a file cabinet, save it in some folder on your computer that isn't going to get destroyed by something. Make sure you're saving your agreements, whether it's with journals or with your publisher, again, so you understand what are the terms of what you need to deliver and what the press is going to deliver for you. And then we do a kind of a dress rehearsal internal to the press for getting it ready for the editorial board. The editorial board is typically made up of OSU faculty in the humanities and social sciences. So sometimes we are going to select people. For example, narrative studies is very big at OSU. So we want to have somebody who's has some background in narrative on the board or things like that. So we have some kind of power. Sometimes we have power in selecting who's on our board and if they can kind of bring that perspective in when we're having meetings. And so we really discuss internal to the press, make sure everything's ironed out, and we are really putting our best foot forward for the board meeting. Because again, we are with you. We want to make sure that this goes through and that we put it in publication. And then, there are some horror stories that, you even get to that stage and it's declined by the board and, at least the relationships with that press, but it's never, I think, going to be something that your editor wants or even the department or the press will want. It might be kind of outside of their power to control. But again, these are really rare instances of kind of things falling apart, but I'll let somebody answer.
I don't really have anything to add. That was a, you all touched on all of it. At Florida, we do have an advanced contract option based on a proposal in the sample chapter. The advanced contract is dependent on positive peer review of the full manuscript and the editorial board approval. I think that's going to be pretty standard across university presses. And like everyone has said, there are rare cases where a project doesn't make it through peer review and we have to reject it after the first or second round. That's not very common. If I'm inviting a manuscript for peer review, then I'm already investing press resources in it. And I'm going to do everything I can to support it and move it forward. The other thing I just wanted to a quick plug, Anna was talking about the proposals. There's a book, the book proposal book by Laura Portwood Stacer that I highly recommend. It's really, really good. It has some samples of proposals and parts of proposals that they can be really helpful.
I actually wouldn't mind tagging one thing onto that, which is there's different approaches to editorial boards too. Because I'm Canadian and in Canada, several Canadian presses will be essentially stuck at the number of books they're going to publish per year. So there might be a book that passes peer review that is liked, and the editorial board is going to say, well, it's a great project. It didn't make the cut. If something like that happens, which is the horror for most scholars, talk to your editor, because we will generally know other people in acquisitions who might be able to pick things up quickly. And if you're moving on to another press and you've had good peer review and you've successfully done the revisions and so forth, in general, we're more than happy to talk with the other acquisitions editor and let them know how things stood, who not to approach again for peer review, or if they need to, if they're going to look at it and say, oh, you have glowing peer review, we can probably work on this fairly quickly. we can talk to them and say, well, here's someone who would be able to respond very quickly to a second round of review. So, talk to us about those things rather than that you're terrible people and this should have worked out. We'll generally find ways to help.
And just also adding, sometimes we are in the situation, acquisitions editors are in a situation where we're competing for a book, and that is also a good place for you to be. If more than one press says, I really want to put this into peer review right now, or something like that, and you don't need to say what the other press is, but be transparent. You can also be in a situation where that editor is willing to, without putting it into peer review, offer a contract because it's something that's really coveted, and they'll know, well, we'll lose it without it being done. So again, it's not super common, but it is, if you find yourself in that situation, be happy. Do not feel like, oh my God, I'm being terrible and I feel guilty about these two presses and two people who I've had conversations with that I both like. It's a good situation to be in, and we'll discuss more about what's going to be a good fit for you as well as for them. But that can also be a time where you can leverage an advanced contract even without peer review. But again, this is not all presses.
So just as a, you can all hear me, right? One of my earbuds died. I want to make sure that it's not the microphone one. So the proposal is one of those things that causes some, I guess, anxiety. And so I like the resources that both of the resources that Anna and Stephanie mentioned are wonderful. But I thought maybe it might be a good thing to kind of just invite my colleagues to point out the things that they, what might be red flags or the things that they see repeated in proposals that they are repeatedly, cutting out. So sort of like the much more sophisticated, less easy to anticipate, equivalent of student papers that start with Webster's Dictionary defines X as, right? Where you're like, oh, you shouldn't do that, or since the dawn of time, you shouldn't do that, right? At the start of a paper. I mean, there are things in proposals that we see all the time that we're constantly helping scholars understand that's not going to look good. That's not a good look, right? Even though it's totally understandable why you said that. So I thought I would just invite my colleagues to that. And then there's a great question for us also in the chat that all of us can answer. So anyone want to share? I have a few, so I'll let you go first so I don't take your idea.
If we're being ridiculous, I don't mind, but I think Anna had a big laugh, so she might have I can say it's throughout all of human history is probably the equivalent of never been done before. If I consider, because my next book is on someone who's completely forgotten from 19th century literary history. And the biggest challenge for the press is not, oh my goodness, this is totally new and never been done before. It's, well, then so what? There's no established group of people interested in this, which is actually a bigger challenge. So rather than the usual, no one has ever talked about X, because often that's really not true when we look at the proposals. Lots of people have talked about X, just not in the same way as you. Don't feel that you have to be completely new. You don't need to tell us a long yarn about how you're the first person to do X. That habit can go the same way as the ways in which are throughout all of human history. And the same thing for sales. I anticipate this having 10,000 sales. Everyone and their dog will want this as marketed to the general public. Totally not helpful to us. Let us know. Who could we actually market it to? What other books are like this? Where are those books being found and sold? That gives us information we can really use. You don't have to be first to market to have something that we want to help share and spread and get on its way to readers. But I look forward to Anna's story. No,
I'm sorry. I made it seem more exciting than it probably is. I think it's just my head went more to like pet peeves than that, because I think if there's not a good fit, I think we kind of have a template way to communicate that to you. But when we're like, there's something that really piques our interest and then we're reading it that way. For me, again, it's a pet peeve. It's not, you shouldn't think like, oh my gosh, this is the only way to ever write a proposal. Again, make sure you have a mentor and that you find good successful in that somebody from this proposal, this was published, and sometimes you'll be amazed that, hey, there's spelling mistakes. It wasn't addressed to the right person, but please do try to make sure that that acquisitions editor works there, or something like that. You'll sometimes be amazed at how robust it is, or you know, with maybe the small mistakes. But for me, I think it's taking a long time to get to what your argument is. If I don't quite see it in the first page or so, I'm like, okay, when is it? And if I have to scroll down, and I'm like, this is really interesting stuff. I hope there's an argument. I'm like, at that point, I'm praying, you know, whatever it is that you believe in. I'm really praying at that moment that there is going to be an argument. And it's not just, this is a collection of really interesting things that I've amassed, but I don't have quite that moment, that kernel of a thesis or an argument. Yeah, that's what I think it would then trigger a red flag if after, you know, pages and pages of things, I don't read it. And it's sometimes, you know, just buried. It's buried in some paragraph. But you know, whether it's, and I've seen this across junior scholars, people doing scholars doing their first book or their second book or their nth book, and sometimes people get very excited about other people's scholarship and making sure that you give voice to the coolness or the innovativeness of your approach or methodology without really putting front and center, this is my argument and this is why it's important. And again, it may be a pet peeve, just as long as it's in there, make sure that, you know, of all the wonderful things that you do discover, make sure that the argument is in there.
Yes, not the time to hold back.
My pet peeve would be saying that the audience is a general audience, or, you know, that I don't know, scholars interested in all of these disciplines are going to be interested in my book. And that's what I'm going to send it back to you. If I'm interested in the project, I'm still going to send it back and say, I need this to be more realistic. I can't present this to my marketing department and say the author expects us to sell this to everyone. We don't sell books to everyone. We sell books in, you know, university presses have niches. We have certain areas that we specialize in. And so I want to know what your specialty area is and whether that matches with what we think it is and what we're capable of marketing to. And so it's just that's my pet peeve, because it's just not helpful. It's not the information I need. And so I usually have to go back and forth with the author just to try to get more accurate information.
And just a very quick follow-up, so sorry, but that doesn't mean that we're not interested in interdisciplinary work. It's just that when we actually send, you know, if we believe you and you said it's all this, and we send it out to 2 readers, and those 2 readers may respond like, we've known this for 20 years. I don't know why they're talking about it as if it's exciting. That's what we want to prevent. That's what we never want to happen. And that's why, you know, when we say be very grounded in who your audience is and something we'll talk, it's not that we don't love interdisciplinary work. We do. We want to make sure that you do reach the audience that you want to reach.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because we'll look at that and choose peer reviewers based on who you see as the main audience, right? And so those peer reviewers are the ones who are going to help us decide if the book gets published, if the book moves forward. So being realistic about that, yeah.
So I have 2. The first one is Overstated Claims. And I think that comes from, it's something everyone is saying, but just to sort of short up, Overstated Claims. You know, writing a book proposal is the exact opposite of writing a cover letter for a job. When you write a cover letter for a job, you are a discipline changing, up and coming, you know, you are going to just revolutionize the field from the inside out, and everybody loves you, and you know, and it's all exaggerated because you just finished grad school. And but that's what you have to say. It's sort of like when you're writing a recommendation for a student, right? And a student you really, really, really liked. It's like, this is one of the finest students I've ever had, top 5%, you know, or top 1%. This person, you know, did this remarkable thing. And, you know, this person challenged me in the classroom. And, you know, you say all kinds of stuff because that's the game, right? But when it comes to publishing a book, it's like, no, actually, if you are overstating your claims, what will happen is the peer reviewers will say, I don't think this is field changing. And they'll write a negative, they'll seize on where you're exaggerating, and they'll challenge your exaggeration instead of engaging with your actual argument. So you're not doing yourself any favors by overstating what the book does, because chances are what the book does is worth publishing, and you want people to engage with that rather than, you know, seize on to things that really no one believes anyway, right? You know, this is a field-changing book. They come along every once in a while, but, you know, it's really, really rare, let's be honest, right? And the other one is when it comes to audience, you know, we usually ask, like, you know, who, you know, and everyone shared a little something about this, but one of the things that I get relatively often is a long list of libraries or a long list of courses taught at different universities where, you know, this book might be used in that course. I don't know, I don't need the course number at the University of Nebraska. It's never gonna, like, it's not gonna help me. I'm not, like, there's no marketing team who's going to reach out to the instructor who created that syllabus and say, I actually think this fits into the fourth paragraph, you know, to the fourth day of your syllabus. This, like, nobody is going to do that, right? So, you know, I would just, you know, just say the scholarly audience of people working in this area and that area is sufficient, right? And we know those things are being taught, right? Or if you are working in an area where there is an increased demand for some reason in that subfield, right, where there's like a lot more courses being taught, or there's something topical about the book, right? Like one of the books that I acquired and we're publishing is Me Too and Modernism. And, you know, that book, I think it's totally reasonable for the person to say, this is a book that helps, you know, initiate conversations about modernist texts that do raise questions that are of interest to students, but faculty and students don't know how to talk about that together. And this book will facilitate those conversations in the classroom, which is more and more becoming a part of the discourse in the classroom at the gen ed level and also at the graduate level. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to say for that kind of book. But if it's a book on, you know, T.S. Eliot and the Italians or something, it's like, you can give me a long list, and I just don't think that that book is going to be used in many undergraduate classes. Doesn't mean I'm not interested. Doesn't mean it's not valuable. It's just not true, right? So it's kind of a waste of your time. So there's a question here in the chat from Angela. Thanks for asking it. I think it's a really good question. It's to me because I was the one who opened my mouth and said we see big trends. But I do have a few that come to mind that I'm happy to share. One is in our in New Modernist Studies and the sort of horizontal and vertical, or however we're thinking about it, expansion of chronology, but also geographies. One of the things that I found really interesting over the past 6 months or so, maybe a year, is that I've seen proposal after proposal after proposal that is decentering modernists from to Spain. So it as much as Spain is right there and in Western Europe, it's not really decentralizing from the Western. That said, there are so many texts that are written about by the core modernists who are in Paris or London, whatever, and they're writing about those texts. They're reviewing those texts in little magazines, and none of us have ever read those texts. So I'm getting proposals for English translations of Spanish texts. There's real interest in the Spanish Civil War. There's real interest in propaganda, and there's real interest in both the politics and just the sort of internal kind of what the Spanish identity might say about modernist identity more broadly, interrogating that concept in different ways, and that the Spanish state came together in a way that's a little different and a little later than others. And there's no you're Catalan or you're Basque or you're Castilian, right? And those identities were not uniform or coherent in the period in which we were studying, right? The period we're studying. And so how does that play out? So I'm seeing a lot more nuance and things in terms of Spanish literature and how it relates to, or how it's more integral to modernism as we see it. I mean, how many of us have taught a survey course on modernism and included a Spanish text? I have not, right? So it's kind of surprising, but there's real genuine interest there. So I'll just share one because I can give you up for a long time, but I'll let the others see if there's some big trends.
in modernist studies, I think a lot of what I've seen is, like John, the other appearances of modernism, which is both new, but we can go back to the 90s. And Edward Said was pointing out that modernity was unevenly distributed and that it's appearing in different timeframes everywhere. It's not new per se, but certainly when was modernism in China? When and where was modernism in Japan? And what does it have to do with Pound and No and so forth? Those kinds of geographical or temporal redistributions of the moment or location or locality of modernism seem like there's stuff afoot there. But I don't know if I would say that's a trend. Not so much what I'm seeing for our submissions, because it's not a field we compete in, but Indigenous studies linking with modernist studies appears to be a place where there's some really exciting and interesting work, but also I think a good deal of competition among presses to get that material.
And Stephanie, you don't have to be put on the spot here. It's okay if you don't have, I was the one who made the big bold statement, so I'm like I say, ethics. I've seen a lot of books about ethics. I think what it means to be ethical now versus that period, it sort of gets to the core of questions we were asking these questions, and Monterists were asking these questions in the 90s a lot too. And it's sort of like in the same way that the kids are wearing things that were popular when I was a kid. We're returning to ethics, but now it makes sense we'd be returning to ethics. We haven't had any as as a society for a little while, right? So it shouldn't be so surprising that there's like a return to a place of thinking about not just what makes someone good in terms of a prose stylist or a poet or a painter, but in terms of proficiency and skill, but what makes them good, like what makes them worth reading. I mean, we all say we're studying the humanities to sort of seek out what it means to be human, and that's like the most cliche but most true at the core of what it is we're all doing and why there's value in it, right? Like if your work doesn't tie back to why we should care about that now, right, then there's some piece missing that is going to make it feel more stilted and less valuable to people reading it, right? If they can't, there's no way to relate to it on a human level as well as a scholar, right? If it's just an intellectual exercise, it's less interesting. That's just human nature, right? And a lot of the ethics of the period that we study are seriously questionable. Some of those people were not good, right? And I mean, this is something we've known for a long time. Everyone who ever interviewed me for a tenure track job in the English department seemed to know that the people I study are not good, right? But Monterists, on the other hand, have I mean, in general, I mean, we sort of take it as we've talked about Ezra Pound's fascism. We've talked about T.S. Eliot's anti-democratic stance, but I'm seeing complications of those narratives. That's what I'm getting at. Like, I can do Eliot really easy. Like, now that we have Eliot's complete prose, his suggestion that democracy can be frightening because it lacks the stability and relies on informal institutions that are not codified in and can be challenged and corrupted and requires constant work. And if you're not willing to, if the society is not willing to do it, it can fall into authoritarianism really quickly. He witnessed that, right? So when he says, there's something about the monarchy that's really good, for years and years, we've painted him with the brush of, he's this horrible, semi-fascist, or at least, proto-fascist, writer. I mean, the number of times I've been told, how do you live with yourself? Study T.S. Eliot, I can't even tell you. And actually now reading him whole in this different context, some of the conversations about ethics are making me rethink some of those really deeply entrenched narratives about modernist writers. And in addition to Eliot, in the same way that, viral modernisms made me go, oh, For the first time in a long time, I read The Wasteland differently. Madame Sosostris and her wicked pack of cards had a wicked cold, right? Right. That's, that's why, they're constantly going to the country in his correspondence. That's why, they're constantly worried about, feeling like they have the sniffles. That's why they're constantly, it completely reshaped the way that I was thinking about key texts that I've read. I thought I'd never think about them differently again. And some of the conversations about ethics are doing some of the same thing, like really just challenging who these writers were based on archives opening, right? Which is another big trend too. I mean, we were theory, then we went to archives, then we went to sort of little magazines and things that are not the core primary materials and the cultural production around the literary text. And now that the archives are all opening, now we're going back to wait, there are all these texts we didn't know about, right? There's all these materials, right? So the number of books that I'm getting about this archive that's sort of grounded in a new set of materials and how that changes the way that we think about a writer or a group of writers. It's really exciting.
Can I just ask you, John, when you say a lot of archival work is coming out, I was wondering, when you say this huge body of ethics work is about to be published and it's really interesting, what theorists are you seeing? Are we getting the same old sort of Levinas, Derrida, or and more recently Butler, or are we getting some exciting new theorists and philosophers who are being referred to more readily and more sort of commonly?
So I really don't mean it. So I don't mean this in any kind of pejorative sense, but I'm not a theorist in any way. And we don't tend to publish a lot of theory heavy work, which is one of the ways in which it's just, comes in as just a little different than, some other presses. Which is not to say that I don't value theory or it is not worthwhile, but I've seen those proposals, but as soon as it goes in a theoretical direction, other than new materialism, which we got into and now we're there. But, other than that, I tend to say, who I think would be a really good editor for that is this other person. So the kinds of things that I'm seeing, that I'm seeing stuff like that, but I'm also seeing, books about, that just are more historically driven. Thinking about so one of the ones that our board just approved that I'm wrapping up in ethics is Lessons from the Harlem Renaissance, which is about social justice movements and the origins of social justice movements in modernism and how that relates to Black Lives Matter and how we shouldn't divorce the texts that we read and study from the world in which we live, and that they can inform the way that we should think about how to approach. We need to learn from previous generations of activism or activists and things like that. And there is an inherent implicit conversation about ethics there that's pretty foregrounded in the introduction, but it's historically driven, right?
Okay,
so
that's interesting.
I wish that I were more conversant in theory, but then again, I don't. Only in that there are other people who can do that better than I can.
Or I think I've seen other moves where it's not about traditional philosopher or theorist or Merleau-Ponty or something like that, but thinking of an author as a kind of a theorist by themselves. For how is Nella Larson creating her own kind of theory of the human, for example, or something like that. Is what I see and what I find exciting, and too as an editor, if we kind of, yes, of course, there's many reasons why we go to and appreciate the conversations that Derrida and Foucault and all of them have brought to us, and it's been very enriching. But kind of seeing other ways in which other with people with different backgrounds, different kinds of philosophers or authors themselves who are theorists, and maybe that's not what they're known for, but that was a track that they wrote, and this is where they laid down the law and applying it to their oeuvre. So
I love that perspective, and that's why I love to study Woolf, because I think she was just such a brilliant philosopher. But I guess what I'm interested in is, from your perspective, when you say you find it exciting, how are these works framed, if not in reference to a philosopher? Are they framed in terms of, say, like I read a book recently that looked at Woolf's mysticism in relation to Iris Murdoch's mysticism. So they had these two authors in conversation. And so that's the way the frame worked for mysticism. And so you could see, you could see Woolf's mysticism very, very clearly, because there was a comparison there that was also creative and that was in conversation with the thoughts of its time. But how are you, what is it about these projects that interests you if it's not theory that's offering that frame?
I'm sorry, can you rephrase the question? I mean, just in broad, I'm sorry, more broadly, what interests me about projects, or, yeah, no, I'm so sorry.
No, I just meant that if it's say ethics in say Woolf, for example, and we're not putting this in terms of theory, how are we? What kind of frame is exciting to you as a publisher if somebody's going to come to you and say, oh, I'm interested in, I'm just grabbing out of the air Woolf and ethics, but because it's almost
Oh, I think I understand better.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, yes. And other people can defend in. But I think what I meant by it that's exciting is the idea that an author, for example, Woolf, was always speaking in response to, or subservient to this idea, or even, being anachronological, that this is how we can use what Derrida uses, brought us to read Woolf. Again, those projects are great. They're wonderful. We publish them. That's fine. But when we reorient that, like, how was Woolf herself a theorist? How can we read her as a theorist? Or as you mentioned, how can we see her with contemporary people who were practicing mediums, spiritualists, whatever it is. And based on those practices at the time, this is how she's taking that and making it fiction, or this is the significance of those things. It's really up to you to create those relationships. I think the important thing for us is, what's the significance of seeing it this way, or pairing these different people? That's what I think grabs our attention. But when it does do these, when we're talking about, for example, Woolf's and ethics, but we're not talking about the canon of philosophers about ethics that we typically do, and you're talking about it this way, what are we supposed to get out of that new pairing or new triangulation?
Okay, I understand.
I think another way of answering that question is to say what I personally, for me, I'll speak for myself and that's it. What I don't get excited about. And what I don't get excited about is when I feel like someone is going to try to teach me the con, instead of actually engaging with the primary, with the literary text, right? So that's happened more than once, and I just say, thanks, but no thanks. It feels very cookie cutter. It's applying this to that. It might be useful. It's just not. It's not for me. And I'm just a historicist through and through. And so if I get to choose what I'm going to work on, and I do, that's one of the perks of this job. You get to choose what you want to work on, and it's a better fit for me if it's more historicist oriented. That's not to say that work isn't valuable, but thanks, Kimberly. I'm wondering if, so we have 15 minutes or so. If there's another question, that's perfectly fantastic. I don't think we have enough time to go through the, the life cycle of a book, although happy to do that some other time.
John, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think there is a hand raised.
Perfect. Okay, great.
Could you also tell us about edited collections and how, how should one prepare a proposal for that, or anything you want to say about it? Thank you.
There's lots to say on edited collections.
They're not easier than writing your own book. Let's put it that. Let's be honest. That's the first thing that we, in terms of time commitment and energy and the politics and all of that stuff. There's a lot to manage, and so I don't know. As a just finishing graduate school, I really wanted to get to know someone and work with her better. And I really admired her work. And so I asked her if I had an idea for a collection. I asked her if she wanted to edit together, and we did. And it was a really good and enriching experience that took about the amount of time that it would have for us to write 2 books together. So thinking that it's easier because you don't have to write all the content is not true, because you will actually end up writing quite a bit of the content. So that's just one thing to say about it. I'm sure there's tons of others. They can be really enriching. There's more community in them, I think, right? So on the positive side, I really like contributing to edited collections because I feel like you're part of the conversation. And I think that there's a little bit, scholars sometimes tend to be a little too dismissive because they think that there's not peer review in the way that there is. Like, if you publish in modernity, well, obviously you're, fantastic. And the truth is, the scrutiny that your work will be under between the whole book going for peer review and getting, dealing with those peer reviewers, and then having 2 editors whose name is on the cover of the book. And they care deeply about your, to make sure that that is the very best thing that could ever possibly be, because their name is on the cover. You will get people who are more hands-on with your work than any other thing that you're going to do. And then, of course, there's an editor too, right? So I think that there's actually more peer review that goes into, I've had to rewrite book chapters for edited collections like 4 times, right? Whereas with an article, I just would have moved on to a different journal, right? Until they took what I had, right? Or, it was feasible, right? Rather than just kind of like breaking its neck and writing a different essay because it fits better into a collection, or, hits on a topic or covers something that editors feel need to be covered in the, for it to have some veneer of comprehensiveness. So anyway, that's just to say, they're really enriching and worthwhile things.
Yes, and I guess the things that I look forward, and just to also add to that, it is going to really test your project management skills, because it's not just what you are doing and the research that you can do and the writing that you can kind of complete, but you're wrangling your co-editor, or they're wrangling you and your contributors. So that is one kind of, you're going to have to wear a different hat in terms of that. But some of the things that I really look at is an understanding that the situation you're going to get yourself into in edit collections, which again can be really valuable if they're really if they're kind of really doing it right, is that it's a chicken and egg problem, because typically you're not going to get, I don't know if I should say typically, you might not get an editor that's interested in an edited volume until you really understand and articulate what it's doing. And at the same time, it's hard to get contributors to say, I'm going to put my time into this if I don't see a contract. So it's, again, that I haven't found a way out of that really, other than to say that one of the things that I really want to make sure that it's there is that although I understand that the purpose, is sometimes to gather these very important, diverse, different, and diverse, broadly defined, diverse voices into your edit collection. How is it cohering? Cohere, basically. And, so how is this a book versus a special issue of a journal? And if you can't really answer that question for me, then maybe it should be a special issue of a journal, or maybe you just need to really rethink and say, not that to quelch or nullify the voices that you brought in. And depending on where you are and who you are, this might be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I got that person into my edited collection. Or it's like, oh, I want to make sure that I'm giving my graduate student a place to write and be known by this community. So again, you might be in either kind of side of the spectrum, but that you're making sure that every single article is really hammering home a kind of overall idea, whether they're engaging, and sometimes it can be a fun way to do it. So the most recent example that I think was done very elegantly, very well, it was kind of Afrofuturism, and it's an edit collection on Afrofuturism in our New Sense series. And what they did is they interviewed a couple of, and these were people, also authors or editors that were well connected, that were able to get current contemporary, they're still alive authors to talk about Afrofuturism and what it means to you. So I was a broad range from it means nothing to me because I'm from Africa and this is the kind of an American convention, to this is very important and it's kind of how I see my work, how I conceptualize my work, and kind of the intellectual thread that I draw from. And then the essays really responded to that little Q&A between the authors. And so it was very much informed by that first idea. It's again, it's something that is cohering, that it is really put together, that yes, these are very distinct voices doing distinct kinds of work, but that you have a sense of what is the mission of this? And again, why is this a book versus is this maybe a better suited as another genre of work? So anyway, I'll stop there. I'm sure other folks will have, again, we have plenty to say about edit collections.
Yeah, I would agree. Cohesion. The two suggestions that I see most often from reader reports of edited collections are the introduction needs to do a better job of framing the volume, and that the chapters need to be in conversation with each other. And so I always recommend that volume editors have contributors read the chapters that are most relevant to their work, because that puts them in dialogue, right? That has them all speaking the same language, and that the volume editors are prepared to do that kind of heavier lifting of the framing that's required in the introduction to kind of set the stage, kind of create this cohesive set of chapters to follow.
I just tag in to say there's some really interesting workarounds for getting that cohesion and interaction as well. I'm a big fan of Stephen Ross's Modernism in Theory from Routledge Commercial Press, where there's literally respondents to the chapters writing their own critical responses. I've done the same thing in a journal issue. Likewise, there's a lot of myths around edited collections that you see, on Twitter or Facebook or wherever people talk to you about at conferences. Presses don't want edited collections. Review committees don't like edited collections. Conference proceedings are dead. No one would ever do that. They're myths. I like edited collections just fine. They can be wonderful books when they're done right, like any other book. We very recently published a book on suburbs that came from a conference in Toulouse. And because everyone had been at a conference, it wasn't every contributor. They'd already heard each other's work. They'd already had their conversations about it over drinks. They were able to reformulate their materials in a way that really cohered and made a conversation in the book. And that's a great thing. But if I listen to what I see on Twitter, it'd be no one would ever want an edited collection that derived from a conference. Lots of people will, if it's a good one. But as Joan's original point was, having edited collections myself, it is work. You can probably write, a nice slim volume and have that done with less work than it takes to herd academics to all move in the same direction and have civil conversations with each other. I won't say too much more joking about that because we're all good people and we all get along until we don't. But edited collections can be wonderful projects, even though they do require that extra effort from those involved. And also to reiterate Anna's point about the introduction, an introduction that has something it actually wants to say, not just a group of people who wants to summarize. I don't need to read, we've all done it, but I don't need to read a summary of each chapter. I would far rather find out what is that narrative red thread, like a mystery novel, that leads me through those chapters. Tell me why they've been placed in a particular order. Don't just do it. So I remember someone getting very upset about a peer review, not a peer review, a published review, where someone said there's no discernible rationale for the order of the sequence of the chapters. The person responded to the review by saying, "Hey, you're terrible people. I ordered the chapters in the order of first performance, not date of first publication, because it's a theater thing." It's like, yeah, you never said that. That would have been the vital piece of information we really needed. Paul Gray published it anyway, but you don't want to be on the end of that. So find a way for introductions to really have an argument you want to make, and let us know why the book is as it is, because it might not always be apparent to people from the outside.
One thing that just occurred to me while you were talking, James, that is worth saying, just because it took me a long time to realize it. Working on lots of books and reading the reviews of lots of books rather than the reviews of your own work, right? Or a review that you read, or trying to write a review, you sort of read around and see what other people have said. Reading reviews of books that you were a part of in a way and care a lot about, you start to realize every one of them quotes from the introduction. They don't quote from the middle of the book, right? So the introduction is an important articulation of what the project wants to set out to do and how it's going to achieve it and how it achieves it, right? I mean, if you don't do that in the introduction, you don't give a reviewer for a published review the quote that they want to use. Like, they want you to have a clear articulation so that they can, they're going to put your statement about what it is that your book does in the top journal in your field, right? Like, give them the sentence to put in that journal to attract people to your work. Do it, right?
Can I add a 20-second anecdote? I was on a boat with Terry Eagleton in the middle of the Adriatic, really. And I was curious because he'd written this weird review a couple of years earlier. So I asked him about it. Maybe no one he'd ever know. He was just hiding behind his newspaper, but we had to spend 3 hours in a boat together. And he said, I basically asked him, why did you write this in your review saying the author never did this when they actually did it in the second chapter? And he looked at me and said, I can't possibly read all the things I review. Keep that in mind. Reviewers are often moving very quickly through books, and they might be doing it as a favor for someone. They want to say nice things, but you got to let your reader know what you're doing, because sometimes they're moving at top speed. They're not always looking at it for their own research. It's not necessarily something they're personally invested in.
I'd say that's true for edited collections and single author monographs, right?
And part of it, we didn't really get to do the life cycle, but hopefully your acquisitions editor, I mean, they'll know who. It'll be a blinded process or an anonymized process, so they'll know who the readers are depending on the press. Most humanities is just a single anonymized process, so the author doesn't know the readers, but the readers do know who the author is. But they can hopefully, in their in their email with the reports, they can help you sort of kind of grapple with it. Again, if we see any kind of territorial, and sometimes it does happen when we think, oh, this is going to be an ideal reader, and it's like, yes, but they want this to be theirs. We, depending on how, what the report is like, we will try to make sure that in terms of what is important for the process, again, we're very process oriented for the process, that we can get you through the next hurdle that we have, and for you to focus on what is necessary to really address at this stage, because it's not going to be this clean, crisp document. We hope to fully get that when we're nearing production, but the things that you should prioritize in terms of your revision or completing the manuscript, or doing that kinds of things. So and if it's bad, sometimes we'll find a third reader to sort of even things out and get another perspective to make, again, because we are invested in making sure we go forward. But that is something, hopefully, again, we can, as editors, as responsible editors, will help guide you. And again, what is the important thing to address at this stage of the process, so that we can all kind of move forward.
Well, I think we're getting really close to the scheduled end of time here. If there are any last minute quick questions, maybe we could take that. But I imagine any question that comes in would require more time to answer than we have left. So I would like to thank our four editors and 4 representatives from 4 great university presses for taking the time to talk with us about what can be a very intimidating process and sort of actually a very obscure one that doesn't need to be so obscure or opaque. And so I think one thread that sort of ran through this is if you're interested or are curious if anyone would be interested in your book, that you should ask someone, right? And reach out to the people here, or reach out to the people here and ask them who maybe you should reach out to if you have a book idea, regardless of where you are in the process or what your rank is, or what your position is in terms of an institution or academia. So I hope that's okay to say all of that, and that what was true to the spirit of the
Absolutely.
session.
Thank you.
Yeah. Right. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming. I think we can wrap this up, and I'll see a lot of you throughout the week, I hope.